All right, history fans, now that we have a little bit of background on the Cold War, we can get into some of the major events that helped heat up the Cold War. And I hope you enjoy it. It's a pretty interesting topic, and we'll be able to spend a little bit of time on it this week. Um, so, in 1946, Winston Churchill, who is famous for leading the British during World War II, comes to the United States, and he gives this really important and influential speech known as the Iron Curtain speech, where he is going to stand up in front of the American people, the American public, and he's going to essentially paint a grim picture of post-war Europe. And he's going to share his belief that Europe is essentially heading into unknown, territory here. And he's going to claim that a iron curtain, a symbolic iron curtain, is going to descend across Europe and divide Europe between a communist East and a capitalist West. And what does this look like? Well, essentially, symbolically, this red line will um, be the Iron Curtain. And you can see the countries influenced by the Soviet Union, known as the Eastern Bloc nations here. So Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on. And then the Western nations of West Germany, France, Italy, Great Britain, and so on. This is going to be the divide we need to focus on in Europe, and it's going to be really the center of the Cold War here, especially in Germany. Germany is going to become a major symbol of the Cold War. So why does he give this speech? Why does Winston Churchill give this speech? Well, he wants to make this real for Americans. We tend to not forget what's going on across the globe, but we're so isolated from other parts of the world. We have two big, beautiful oceans separating us from, Europe and Asia and Africa. And, we have two very friendly neighbors to the north and south. So we tend to forget that, in a place like Europe, you're really close to your neighbors, and if your neighbors are hostile or have a different ideology than you, then it can cause a great amount of anxiety for a country. So, that's something to think about. And Winston Churchill wants to make this very apparent to Americans. All right, and after this, America really does get involved, substantial amount in the Cold War in this fight against communism and the Soviet Union. So, before we get a little deeper into that, I must tell you that, behind the curtain, east of the curtain, there was resistance to the Soviet Union. It wasn't like every country wanted to be like this Stalinist dictatorship, right? Now, in 1956, a couple of years after Stalin actually dies, and there's this new leader in the Soviet Union, his name is Nikita Khrushchev. In this country of Hungary, all right, they want reform. They want some change. They want to, have some loosening of the economic restrictions under the Soviet system and political restrictions under the Soviet system. And that wasn't, something the Soviet Union and Russia in particular wanted to see. Again, it was Russia's way, it was the Soviet Union's way or the highway. And if you didn't follow, the path set forth by the Soviet Union, then quite frankly, the Warsaw Pact would, essentially roll troops and tanks into your country to stop you. And that's pretty much what happens here. This revolt starts as a student revolt, so young people on the streets, throughout the country, centered in Budapest, the capital, and then it spread after that, and more people got involved, and then it is put down, quite simply, by the Soviet Union. Soviet troops will march in, and this is one of my favorite photos of the Cold War. You can see the statue of Joseph Stalin destroyed, and put on display, headless. in the streets. So another country that goes through resistance and has a revolt against the Soviet system is going to be Czechoslovakia. Now, this is in the really intense year of 1968. 1968 across the globe is a massive year. It's one of those important years in world history. You see student protests in France. You see assassinations in the United States. It's an election year. A very important election year in the United States. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated during this year, which was a devastating blow to the civil rights movement, and so on. So it's a big year, but really big year in the Cold War as well. And this event is known as the Prague Spring. And essentially, what ends up happening is, these a loose organization of groups in Czechoslovakia. They want political change. They want to lessen the restrictions on the press and freedom of speech. So they want to increase freedom of speech and freedom of the press in Czechoslovakia. And of course, the Soviets, just like in Hungary, don't want this. So they end up sending Warsaw Pact troops into Prague and into other parts of Czechoslovakia, and they put down the resistance. So a common theme here is if you go against the Soviet system, the Warsaw Pact will send troops in to, quote unquote, correct you. All right. That's something to think about. Now, another major symbol of the Cold War is going to be the Berlin Wall. All right. And basically, as we know, Berlin was split between East Berlin, which is communist, and West Berlin, which was controlled by the Allied nations after World War II. This is completely in East Germany, so it's surrounded by communism, essentially. And what ends up happening is a lot of people are leaving East Berlin because they're seeing the splendors and the prosperity of the West, and they want a piece of the action. So what ends up happening is to stop this, and of course this is just one reason why the Berlin Wall was built, but to stop this from happening, the communists essentially in the East build this massive wall that completely surrounds West Berlin. So you can't get in or out of West Berlin. All right. So this is a big deal because there are a lot of people in West Berlin who have like family members in East Berlin. Well, you're never going to see them because you can't cross this wall, or you can't go across the wall at all. It's a really big deal, and it's going to stay up until 1989. And when the Berlin Wall falls in 1989, that's going to be symbolic for the fall of communism, and we'll get to that soon. All right. Of course, after World War II, atomic weapons, nuclear weapons become a major part of, not only the United States arsenal, but also eventually the Soviet Union's arsenal. The Soviet Union will develop nuclear weapons by the end of the 1940s. So now we have two nations who are hostile, to each other with bombs that could destroy cities in one go. So this is a big deal, and it's going to be, a race to see who can have more, right? The more nukes you have, the stronger your nation is. So an arms race, again, arms are weapons and things like that. So a race to essentially have the most. And this develops between the Soviet Union and the United States, and then China as well. China develops nukes as well. So by 1953, we see hydrogen bombs. Now, thankfully, hydrogen bombs have never been used in war, and the only time we have seen nukes used in war has been in World War II against the Japanese, but they're there, right? And this is going to, in the spread of this is going to be known as nuclear proliferation. So it's the spread of nukes and nuclear technology across the globe. There are many nations that have nukes nowadays. It's the norm for powerful nations. We try to restrict those, and we'll talk about that in our next PowerPoint. But, for now, you can see this competition and just unbelievable number of warheads developed by these nations, by the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States got off to a pretty good start and a good lead, but then, according to the numbers that are provided by the Soviet Union here, the Soviet Union will overtake the United States in the mid 70s. But again, that is information that is coming from Russia during this time. One major conflict that does take place between the United States and the Soviet Union that involves nukes will be the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis is going to take place under the John F. Kennedy administration, and it's going to be the closest that the world has ever come to nuclear war, at least during the Cold War. What was basically happening here is the Soviet Union was stockpiling warheads in Cuba, which is 90 miles away from the United States. The United States obviously doesn't want a communist nation pointing nukes at them from only 90 miles away, which means if you launch a nuke at the United States, we have minutes to prepare as opposed to hours. So very scary time. So the United States essentially, we do a lot of covert operations to, kind of spy on the Soviets in Cuba. And we get all this information basically saying, yeah, well, there are launch sites here. And, they are sending more and more nukes to Cuba. So what are we going to do? Well, the United States sets up this blockade to stop more, nukes essentially from entering Cuba. And this creates this massive standoff and intense negotiations. It lasts for about 13 days. And, we really do come very close to nuclear war here. So, again, a really anxious time, and certainly something, when I talk to family members that have that lived through this time period, they were scared, in the United States, really, really scared. But at the end of the day, the Soviet Union will take their weapons out of Cuba, and the crisis will be ended, after about 13 days or so. All right, something else, technology. So the United States and the Soviet Union are competing in more than just an arms race here. They're also competing in a space race, which is, I would argue, a positive because, we're pouring tons of money into technology and science and getting a better understanding of the world around us. And there are quite a few amazing achievements that take place during this time period. Now, the Soviets will get off to a fast start here. They'll launch, the first animal. This is Laika. Unfortunately, Laika does not survive her journey back into back to Earth, but it is a momentous occasion to have, anything sent into space, right? Including the first human, who will be Russian, and the first artificial satellite, which will be known as Sputnik. The United States will soon, after seeing these achievements by the Soviet Union, pour a lot of money in creating NASA, right, which will, by 1969, put a man on the moon. So the United States will, overtake the Soviet Union in terms of technology, but this competition between the United States and the Soviet Union certainly led to some major achievements. And one of my favorite, just kind of random stories, I'll get back to that in a second, random stories is Miss Baker, a true American hero. Miss Baker is a squirrel monkey and space explorer who will be the first American animal to return alive from a space flight. Now, this monkey lives a long life and has a really good life, one would argue. Here's the little capsule that Miss Baker went in, and there's the ship, or the rocket ship, if you will. Becomes a decorated member of NASA, and of course has a very interesting memorial where people leave bananas for her. It's just a heartwarming story, and I can't imagine this being on any kind of test, but I just thought I'd share Miss Baker. Really interesting story from American history here. But as you can see, guys, the space race, this healthy competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to, for bragging rights, right? To see who has